The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota Territory rangeland when Thomas McKenna first noticed the buzzards circling over the eastern pasture. He pulled his horse to a stop and squinted against the bright October light, counting the dark shapes wheeling against the cloudless sky. 7 birds meant something bigger than a stray calf had met its end out there among the sagebrush and scattered cottonwoods. Thomas had been riding fence for the Rocking W Ranch for 3 years now, ever since he'd drifted north from Texas with nothing but a worn saddle and the clothes on his back. The work was honest, the pay fair, and old William Westbrook treated his hands better than most ranchers in these parts. Thomas had found something he'd been searching for since the war ended. A place where a man could rebuild his life without questions about what came before. He urged his bay gelding toward the circling birds, his practiced eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of trouble. The Rocking W spread covered nearly 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, and predators were always a concern. Mountain lions, wolves, and the occasional bear all took their share of cattle, but something about this felt different. The buzzards were flying too tight a pattern, and they'd been at it too long for a fresh kill. As Thomas rode closer, the acrid smell of gunpowder reached his nostrils, faint but unmistakable. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, fingers checking that the leather thong was loose for a quick draw. Years of frontier living had taught him that the smell of spent ammunition often meant trouble wasn't far behind. The source of the buzzard's interest lay in a shallow depression between 2 low hills, partially hidden by a stand of chokecherry bushes that had turned brilliant red with the autumn frost. Thomas approached carefully, his horse's hooves making soft sounds in the sandy soil. What he found there made him pull up short and reach for the whiskey flask in his saddlebags. 3 men lay sprawled in the grass, their bodies positioned in ways that spoke of sudden, violent death. But these weren't cattle rustlers or drifters caught in some petty dispute. Their clothes were fine quality, their boots expensive leather, and their weapons were the kind of firearms that cost more than most ranch hands made in a year. These were men of means, and their presence on Westbrook's land raised more questions than Thomas cared to contemplate. The first body belonged to a man Thomas recognized, Clayton Morse, a territorial judge who'd been making noise about running for the territorial legislature. Morse lay on his back, arms flung wide, a neat hole in his vest directly over his heart. His face bore an expression of surprise, as if death had found him in the middle of saying something important. The second man was a stranger, but his clothes marked him as someone from back east. His coat was tailored wool, his boots barely scuffed, and a gold watch chain gleamed from his vest pocket. He'd taken a bullet to the head, and from the powder burns on his temple, someone had shot him at very close range. The third body was the most troubling of all. Sheriff Duncan McGrath lay face down in the grass, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight. McGrath had been a fixture in Laredo County for 15 years, known for his fairness and his unwavering honesty. The sight of the lawman's body sent a chill down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Thomas dismounted and walked carefully around the scene, his experienced eye taking in details that might prove important later. The grass was trampled in a rough circle, suggesting the 3 men had been standing together when the shooting started. Empty cartridge cases glinted in the morning light. Someone had fired multiple shots, but only 3 had found their targets. Near Judge Morse's body, Thomas found something that made his blood run cold. A leather portfolio lay open in the grass, its contents scattered by the wind. Official-looking documents bearing territorial seals fluttered among the sagebrush. And even from a distance, Thomas could see enough to understand their significance. These were land grants, mineral rights, and survey reports. The kind of papers that could make or break fortunes in a territory where land was everything. As Thomas gathered the scattered documents, a name kept appearing in the official language and legal descriptions: the Rocking W Ranch. Every single paper dealt with some aspect of William Westbrook's property, from water rights to mineral surveys to something called a federal land reclamation order that Thomas had never heard of before. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These 3 men had been meeting secretly on Westbrook's land, carrying documents that seemed to concern the ranch's future. Now they were dead, and whoever had killed them had left the papers scattered like unwanted trash. Either the killer didn't know the document's value, or they'd gotten what they really came for. Thomas carefully collected every paper he could find, stuffing them into his saddlebags alongside the flask that was starting to feel mighty tempting. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he'd stumbled into. Judge Morse had the authority to sign land grants. Sheriff McGrath would have been involved in any legal disputes over property rights. The stranger from back east could have been anyone. A government surveyor, a railroad representative, or someone else with business interests in the territory. As he prepared to remount his horse, Thomas noticed something else that made him pause. Boot prints in the soft soil near the bodies showed that at least 2 other people had been present during or after the shooting. The prints were clear enough to make out details. One set belonging to someone wearing expensive riding boots with distinctive heel patterns, the other to someone in standard work boots that could have belonged to any cowhand or farmer in the county. More disturbing still, one set of tracks led directly toward the Rocking W Ranch House, while the other headed east toward the territorial road that connected Laredo County to the railroad towns beyond. Whoever had done this killing had split up afterward, with one person heading for the ranch and the other leaving the territory entirely. Thomas stood in the morning silence, holding his horse's reins, and staring down at 3 dead men who'd taken their secrets with them to whatever judgment awaited beyond this world. The smart thing would be to ride straight to town and report what he'd found to the deputy sheriff. But McGrath was dead, and Thomas didn't know if the deputy could be trusted with information this explosive. The smarter thing might be to ride back to the ranch and tell William Westbrook what he'd discovered on Westbrook's own land. But those boot prints leading toward the ranch house raised questions that Thomas wasn't sure he wanted answered. How much did the old man know about this meeting? Had he been involved in whatever business had brought these 3 men together in such a remote location? Thomas pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. It was just past 8 in the morning, which meant he'd been riding fence for less than 2 hours. Nobody at the ranch would expect him back until late afternoon, giving him time to think through his options without arousing suspicion. He decided to follow the tracks that led east, at least for a mile or 2. If he could determine where the second killer had gone, it might provide some clue about who was behind this massacre. The territorial road was only 3 miles from the murder scene, and once someone reached it, they could disappear into any of a dozen towns between here and the Missouri River. The trail was easy to follow across the open grassland. Whoever had made these prints hadn't bothered to conceal their passage, suggesting either confidence or desperation. The boot prints belonged to someone walking quickly, but not running. Someone who knew exactly where they were going and felt no immediate fear of pursuit. As Thomas followed the trail, he found himself thinking about the documents in his saddlebags. The federal land reclamation order was particularly troubling because it suggested that someone in Washington had taken an interest in the Rocking W Ranch. In Thomas's experience, when the federal government started paying attention to private land in the territories, it usually meant trouble for the current owners. The trail led through a grove of cottonwoods along Willow Creek, where Thomas found evidence that the fleeing man had stopped to rest and perhaps clean up. Torn strips of cloth that looked like they'd been used to wipe blood from hands lay scattered near the creek bank. A small fire had been built and hastily extinguished, and the ashes were still warm when Thomas stirred them with a stick. Most telling of all, he found an empty whiskey bottle half buried in the creek bank sand. The label identified it as Kentucky bourbon, expensive stuff that wasn't sold in any of the local saloons. This was drinking whiskey for men with money and refined tastes, the kind of bottle that might be shared between business partners celebrating a successful deal. Thomas pocketed the bottle and continued following the trail toward the territorial road. As he rode, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation crawled between his shoulder blades like a living thing, and more than once he turned in his saddle to scan the empty grassland behind him. The feeling proved justified when he caught a glimpse of movement among the rocks on a distant hillside. Someone was following him, staying well back but matching his pace perfectly. Thomas pretended not to notice while his mind raced through the possibilities. Was it one of the killers, coming back to ensure there were no witnesses? Or could it be someone else who'd been watching the murder scene from a distance? The trail reached the territorial road just as Thomas had expected, but here it disappeared entirely. The hard-packed earth and constant traffic made tracking impossible, and whoever had fled this way was now completely anonymous among the dozens of people who used this route every day. Thomas sat his horse at the crossroads and considered his next move. The sun was climbing toward noon, and he still had fence to check if he wanted to maintain the pretense of a normal day's work. But the weight of the documents in his saddlebags and the knowledge of 3 dead men lying in the grass made normal work seem almost impossible. As he debated his options, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up. A rider was coming from the direction of town, moving at the kind of steady pace that suggested official business. As the figure drew closer, Thomas recognized Deputy Sheriff Alan Carmichael, a young man who'd been working under McGrath for less than a year. Carmichael pulled up beside Thomas with a nod of greeting. The deputy was nervous about something. His hands were shaking slightly, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that suggested he was fighting to maintain control. "Morning, McKenna. You seen anything unusual out this way today? Got a report that someone heard gunshots around dawn." Thomas studied the deputy's face carefully. Carmichael was either genuinely ignorant about what had happened, or he was a better actor than most men in law enforcement. The nervousness could be explained by the responsibility of wearing a badge in country where violent death was never far away. "Can't say I have, deputy. Been riding fence since first light, but I stick to the ranch boundaries mostly." "Who reported hearing shots?" "Telegraph operator in town," said the sound came from this general direction. Carmichael's eyes were constantly moving, scanning the horizon as if he expected trouble to appear at any moment. "Sheriff McGrath rode out early to investigate, but he hasn't reported back yet." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Thomas. The deputy was looking for his boss, not knowing that McGrath lay dead less than 2 miles away. Thomas felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical burden. Tell the truth now, and he'd become the primary witness in a case that might involve powerful people with reasons to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Stay silent, and he'd be concealing a crime that included the murder of a law enforcement officer. "I'll keep my eyes open," Thomas said finally. "If I see anything worth reporting, I'll ride into town this evening." Carmichael nodded and touched his hat brim in farewell. As he rode away toward the Rocking W range, Thomas felt another chill of apprehension. The deputy was heading directly toward the murder scene, and depending on his route, he might discover the bodies within the hour. Thomas made his decision. He turned his horse toward the ranch house, pushing the animal into a steady lope that ate up the miles without attracting attention. Whatever was happening here, he needed to talk to William Westbrook before anyone else stumbled onto the scene. The old rancher had always been straight with his hands, and Thomas hoped that honesty would extend to a situation this complicated. The ride back to headquarters gave Thomas time to organize his thoughts and plan his approach. Westbrook was a careful man who'd built his ranch through hard work and smart business decisions. He wasn't the type to get involved in anything shady, but the documents in Thomas's saddlebags suggested that shady things might be involving him whether he knew it or not. As the ranch buildings came into view, Thomas slowed his horse to a walk and tried to appear as normal as possible. The last thing he wanted was to alarm anyone before he could speak privately with the boss. But as he approached the main house, he noticed something that made his stomach clench with new worry. A buggy sat in front of the house, an expensive vehicle with brass fittings and leather upholstery that marked it as transportation for someone with money and status. The horse hitched to it was a fine animal, well-groomed and fitted with quality tack. Someone important was visiting the Rocking W, and given what Thomas had discovered that morning, the timing felt ominous. Thomas tied his horse to the corral fence and approached the house with careful steps. Through the front window, he could see figures moving in the parlor. Westbrook and at least 2 other people engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. One of the visitors was a woman in an elegant traveling dress, while the other was a man, in the kind of suit that suggested legal or business connections. As Thomas hesitated on the front porch, uncertain whether to interrupt what was obviously private business, he heard voices rising in what sounded like an argument. Words like federal investigation and territorial governor drifted through the window, along with Westbrook's distinctive voice raised in protest. "I don't care what authority you claim to represent," the old rancher was saying. "This ranch has been in my family for 30 years, and no amount of legal paperwork is going to change that fact." A woman's voice responded, cool and professional. Mr. Westbrook, I understand your feelings, but the federal government has clear authority in territorial matters. The documents we've presented are legally binding, and resistance will only make matters worse for everyone involved. Thomas backed away from the window and moved around to the kitchen entrance, where he knew he could enter without being seen. Maria Santos, the ranch's cook and housekeeper, looked up in surprise as he slipped through the back door. Thomas, what are you doing here so early? Did something happen out on the range? Maria had worked for the Westbrook family since before Thomas arrived, and her loyalty to the old man was absolute. If anyone could be trusted with sensitive information, it would be her. Thomas pulled out the whiskey bottle he'd found by the creek and set it on the kitchen table. Maria, I need you to look at this and tell me if you've ever seen it before. The Mexican woman picked up the bottle and examined it carefully, turning it over in her weathered hands. When she looked up at Thomas, her dark eyes were worried. This is expensive whiskey, the kind Don William keeps in his private study. But this bottle, it has been emptied recently. Where did you find this? Before Thomas could answer, the sound of raised voices from the parlor grew louder. Through the kitchen wall, they could hear Westbrook's voice raised in anger, followed by the woman's cool responses. Then came a sound that made both Thomas and Maria freeze. The distinctive metallic click of a gun being cocked. Thomas drew his revolver and moved toward the parlor, but Maria caught his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman of her years, and her whispered words carried the weight of absolute certainty. No, Thomas, whatever is happening in there, it started before you arrived. If you go in now with a gun, you will become part of their trouble instead of helping Don William. She was right, but Thomas could hear the tension in the parlor reaching a dangerous level. Westbrook's voice had taken on the edge that Thomas recognized from the war. The sound a man made when he was being pushed past his breaking point. You can present all the papers you want, Westbrook was saying, but you'll find that possession is 9/10 of the law out here in the territories, and I'm in possession of this ranch, along with enough guns and men to keep it that way. The woman's laugh was cold as winter wind. Mr. Westbrook, I think you misunderstand the nature of your situation. Judge Morse has already signed the necessary orders. Sheriff McGrath has agreed to enforce them. And our associate from the territorial legislature has provided the political backing we need. Your ranch is going to change hands whether you cooperate or not. Thomas felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. The woman was talking about Judge Morse and Sheriff McGrath as if they were still alive and available to carry out whatever plan was unfolding. Either she didn't know about the murders, or she was part of an elaborate deception. As Thomas wrestled with this new information, the sound of gunfire erupted from the parlor. 3 shots in rapid succession, followed by the crash of furniture and a woman's scream. Then silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity before footsteps began moving rapidly through the house. Thomas pushed past Maria and burst through the kitchen door into the parlor, his revolver ready for whatever he might find. The scene that greeted him would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. William Westbrook lay crumpled behind his desk, blood spreading across the papers scattered on its surface. The woman visitor sat in a chair near the window, her traveling dress torn and a small pistol in her trembling hands. The man in the business suit was nowhere to be seen, but the front door stood open, and the sound of a buggy racing away could be heard fading into the distance. The woman looked up at Thomas with eyes that held no sanity. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, and the words she said made Thomas's blood run cold. Just a single shot would have been enough. That's all it would have taken. But he wouldn't listen, and now look what's happened. He made me use all 3 bullets, and I don't have any more. She set the pistol on the table beside her and began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that filled the room with madness. Thomas stepped carefully around Westbrook's body and picked up the weapon she'd discarded. It was a small-caliber revolver, the kind a lady might carry for protection, and all 3 chambers had been fired. As Thomas tried to process what had happened, Maria appeared in the doorway behind him. Her gasp of horror at seeing Westbrook's body was followed immediately by a string of Spanish curses directed at the woman who'd killed him, but the woman seemed oblivious to everything around her, lost in whatever private hell had driven her to murder. Thomas knelt beside Westbrook and checked for any sign of life, but the old rancher was beyond help. 3 bullets had found their mark. And judging by the blood patterns, death had come quickly. On the desk beside his body lay the papers that the visitors had brought. Official documents that Thomas could now see were forgeries. Clever ones, but forgeries nonetheless. The sound of approaching horses made Thomas look toward the open door. Someone was coming fast, and given the morning's events, he doubted it was anyone friendly. He moved to the window and saw Deputy Carmichael riding hard toward the house, accompanied by 2 other men that Thomas didn't recognize. "Maria, take the woman and get her out of sight. Lock her in the root cellar if you have to. But don't let anyone else see her like this." The housekeeper nodded and helped the laughing woman to her feet, guiding her toward the back of the house with surprising gentleness. Thomas stayed in the parlor, trying to arrange the scene to buy himself time to think. The forged documents were obviously part of an elaborate scheme to steal the Rocking W Ranch, but the murders at the meeting site suggested that someone had double-crossed their partners. The woman's presence here, along with her apparent breakdown after shooting Westbrook, indicated that the plan had gone horribly wrong for everyone involved. Deputy Carmichael's voice called from outside. "Hello, the house. This is the law, and I need to speak with William Westbrook immediately." Thomas made his decision. He slipped Westbrook's own revolver from the dead man's holster and placed it in the rancher's hand, then scattered some of the forged papers on the floor as if there'd been a struggle. The scene wouldn't fool an experienced investigator, but it might buy him enough time to figure out who could be trusted with the truth. When he opened the front door, Carmichael was already dismounting, his face grim with official purpose. The 2 men with him stayed mounted but kept their hands near their weapons, suggesting they expected trouble. "Deputy, I'm afraid there's been a shooting. Mr. Westbrook is dead, and I think you'd better see this for yourself." As Carmichael and his companions entered the house, Thomas caught sight of movement in the distance. Someone was watching from the hills above the ranch, using field glasses to observe everything that was happening. The watcher was too far away to identify, but Thomas felt certain it was the same person who'd been following him earlier. Whatever conspiracy had led to this morning's violence was far from over, and Thomas realized he was now standing at the center of a web of deception and murder that stretched from the territorial capital to the federal government itself. The documents in his saddlebags might be the only evidence that could reveal the truth, but they also marked him as a target for whoever was willing to kill, to keep their secrets buried. As Deputy Carmichael examined Westbrook's body and asked increasingly pointed questions, Thomas could only hope that his own survival would last long enough to bring justice to the men who died trying to protect their land from those who would steal it through murder and fraud. Deputy Carmichael stood over William Westbrook's body with the expression of a man who'd bitten into something rotten. His 2 companions spread out through the parlor, examining the scene with the practiced eyes of men accustomed to violence. Thomas recognized the type. Hired guns, trying to pass themselves off as lawmen. "This doesn't look like any suicide I've ever seen," Carmichael muttered, nudging one of the scattered papers with his boot. 3 shots, and the gun's in the wrong hand for the angle of the wounds. Thomas had hoped the deputy would be fooled by the hastily arranged scene, but Carmichael was proving sharper than expected. The young lawman knelt beside Westbrook's desk and began examining the forged documents with obvious interest. "These papers are interesting, McKenna. Federal land grants, mineral surveys, territorial legislature authorizations. Looks like someone was planning to take over this ranch through legal channels." "I wouldn't know anything about that," Thomas replied carefully. "I found Mr. Westbrook like this when I came in from checking fence. Heard gunshots and rode back to investigate." One of Carmichael's companions, a tall man with a carefully waxed mustache, looked up from examining the bloodstains on the wall. His voice carried a slight accent that Thomas couldn't quite place. "Deputy, this scene has been altered. The furniture was moved after the shooting, and someone tried to arrange the body to suggest self-inflicted wounds. We're looking at murder, not suicide." Carmichael's face darkened. "McKenna, I think you'd better come with us for questioning. As the only witness to this scene, you're either the killer, or you know who is." Thomas felt the situation spinning out of control. The documents hidden in his saddlebags seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, and the knowledge of 3 more bodies lying in the eastern pasture pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He needed time to think, But Carmichael seemed determined to wrap up the investigation quickly. "Deputy, I understand your position, but I've been working for Mr. Westbrook for 3 years. He was a good man who paid fair wages and treated his hands with respect. I had no reason to kill him, and plenty of reasons to want him alive." The man with the mustache stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "That's exactly what someone would say after murdering their employer. Deputy, I recommend we take him into custody immediately." Something in the stranger's eagerness to see Thomas arrested triggered a warning bell in the ranch hand's mind. Professional lawmen usually wanted to investigate thoroughly before making arrests, but this man seemed more interested in removing Thomas from the scene than in finding the truth. "Deputy Carmichael," Thomas said slowly, "I don't believe I caught your companions' names. Are they territorial marshals? Or do they have some other authority to be investigating this matter?" Carmichael's hesitation was answer enough. The deputy was young and inexperienced, and these men had probably arrived in town with impressive credentials and official-looking papers. In a frontier community where federal authority was respected but rarely seen, it would be easy for skilled con men to assume control of a local investigation. "These gentlemen are investigating federal crimes in the territory," Carmichael said finally. "I'm cooperating with their inquiry into irregularities involving territorial land grants." The mustached man stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Special Agent Morrison, Territorial Crimes Division. My colleague is Agent Davis. We've been tracking a conspiracy involving forged federal documents, and this ranch appears to be connected to our investigation." Thomas recognized the smooth patter of a confidence man. Morrison spoke with the kind of authority that came from practice rather than genuine position. The story was plausible enough to fool a small-town deputy, but Thomas had seen enough of the world to recognize deception when it was dressed up in official language. "Agent Morrison, I'd be happy to cooperate with any federal investigation, but I think it would be appropriate to contact the Territorial Marshal's office to verify your authority before we proceed." Morrison's smile became strained. "Mr. McKenna, I'm afraid the urgency of this matter doesn't allow for such delays. 3 federal officials have been murdered in this county, and we have reason to believe their deaths are connected to the conspiracy we're investigating." The casual mention of 3 murdered federal officials confirmed Thomas's suspicions. Morrison knew about the bodies in the eastern pasture, which meant he was either involved in their deaths or had learned about them from someone who was. Either way, Thomas was now certain that the so-called federal agents were part of the conspiracy rather than investigators trying to solve it. 3 murdered officials? Thomas tried to sound shocked. "When did this happen?" "I haven't heard anything about federal officials being killed. Early this morning." Davis spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Judge Morse, Sheriff McGrath, and a territorial surveyor were found shot to death on rangeland east of here. We believe their murders are connected to William Westbrook's death." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Davis had described the scene accurately but identified the 3rd victim as a territorial surveyor rather than the eastern stranger whose papers had revealed no clear identity. Either Davis was guessing about the 3rd man's role, or the killers hadn't bothered to thoroughly search their victims. "That's terrible news," Thomas said. "Sheriff McGrath was a good man. Do you have any leads on who might be responsible?" Morrison exchanged a glance with Davis before answering. "We believe the murders were committed by someone trying to prevent the discovery of a conspiracy involving this ranch. Mr. Westbrook may have been killed because he refused to cooperate with the investigators, or because he knew too much about the illegal activities." The story was clever enough to satisfy a casual investigation, but Thomas could see the holes in it. If Westbrook had been killed to silence him, why stage it as a suicide? And why would conspirators murder federal investigators who were supposedly working to expose their crimes? Deputy Carmichael seemed convinced by Morrison's explanation. "Mr. McKenna, in light of this information, I'm going to have to ask you to surrender your weapon and come with us for formal questioning." Thomas evaluated his options quickly. Submitting to arrest would mean turning over his gun and losing any chance of investigating the conspiracy himself. But resisting would mark him as a fugitive and make it impossible to operate openly. He needed a 3rd choice, something that would buy him time while keeping him free to act. "Deputy, I understand your position. But I think you should know that there's someone watching this house from the hills. I spotted them earlier with field glasses, and they're probably still out there. It wasn't entirely a lie. Thomas had seen someone observing the ranch, though he couldn't be certain they were still there. But the mention of a possible accomplice or witness might be enough to complicate Morrison's plans. Morrison's reaction confirmed Thomas's suspicions. The fake agent's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, and his eyes darted toward the windows. A genuine federal investigator would have wanted to locate and interview any potential witnesses, but Morrison seemed more concerned with eliminating them. "Deputy," Morrison said quietly, "I think we should take Mr. McKenna into custody immediately and search the area for this alleged watcher later." Carmichael looked uncertain. The young deputy was clearly out of his depth, trying to balance respect for federal authority against his own instincts about how to conduct an investigation. Thomas decided to push the issue a little further. "There's something else you should know. When I was riding fence this morning, I found signs that someone had been camping near Willow Creek, fresh fire ashes, and this whiskey bottle that doesn't match anything sold in the local saloons." Thomas pulled out the expensive bourbon bottle he'd discovered near the murder scene. Morrison's eyes fixed on it immediately, and Thomas saw recognition in the man's expression. The fake agent knew exactly where that bottle had come from. "That's evidence in a federal investigation," Morrison said quickly. "I'll need to take custody of it immediately." "Of course," Thomas replied, holding the bottle just out of reach. "Deputy Carmichael can log it as evidence and provide you with a proper receipt. I'm sure the territorial marshal will want complete documentation when he reviews the case." Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mr. McKenna, you're interfering with a federal investigation. I can have you arrested for obstruction of justice." "Agent Morrison," a new voice said from the parlor doorway. "I don't think that will be necessary." Everyone turned to see Maria Santos standing in the entrance. Her face composed, but her eyes bright with intelligence. She carried a tray with coffee and cups, playing the role of a simple servant. But Thomas could see she'd been listening to every word of the conversation. "Señores, I have brought coffee for the lawmen. It is a difficult day, and perhaps some refreshment would help clear heads for thinking." Morrison waved dismissively at the Mexican woman. "We don't have time for refreshments. Please leave us to conduct our business." Maria's face hardened at the rude dismissal. "Certainly, señor. But perhaps you would like to know that I saw the men who visited Don William this morning. They arrived in a fine buggy, and one of them looked very much like the gentleman you described as a federal surveyor." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Maria was providing him with cover for his story while potentially exposing Morrison's deception. If the housekeeper had seen the real victims alive at the ranch, it would contradict Morrison's timeline for the murders. "What time did these visitors arrive?" Deputy Carmichael asked, his investigative instincts finally starting to assert themselves. "Just after dawn, Senor Deputy. A man and a woman, both dressed in fine Eastern clothes. They had urgent business with Don William about ranch matters." Morrison stepped closer to Maria, his friendly mask slipping entirely. "Old woman, you need to be very careful about what you think you saw. Memory can be unreliable, especially in times of stress." The threat was clear, but Maria had faced worse than Morrison in her 60 years of life. She met his gaze steadily and spoke with quiet dignity. "My memory is excellent, senor. I remember faces, voices, and times very well. Perhaps the federal authorities would like me to describe these visitors in detail?" Thomas could see Morrison calculating odds and options. The fake agent couldn't silence Maria without alerting Carmichael to his true nature, but he also couldn't allow her testimony to expose his deception. The standoff stretched out until Davis spoke up from across the room. "Morrison, we have what we came for. The local authorities can handle the details from here." The comment revealed more than Davis probably intended. They had come for something specific, possibly the forged documents, or information about the real conspiracy. Thomas's presence had complicated their plans, but they'd apparently achieved their primary objective. "Deputy Carmichael," Morrison said, reasserting his official manner, "we'll be returning to the territorial capital to report our findings to federal authorities. I trust you can handle the local aspects of this investigation." Carmichael nodded, obviously relieved to have the federal agents departing. "Of course, sir. I'll prepare a full report for the territorial marshal. As Morrison and Davis prepared to leave, Thomas noticed Davis palming several of the forged documents from Westbrook's desk. The theft was so smooth that Carmichael missed it entirely, but Thomas filed the information away for future use. "Mr. McKenna," Morrison said as he reached the door, "I strongly advise you to remain available for further questioning. This investigation is far from over, and federal authorities will want to speak with you again." The warning carried an unmistakable threat. Morrison was telling Thomas that running would be useless, that federal resources would track him down anywhere in the territory. But Thomas had spent years learning to read between the lines of official statements, and he understood the real message. Stay quiet, or face the consequences. After the fake agents departed, Deputy Carmichael seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. The young lawman looked around the blood-stained parlor with obvious confusion, clearly overwhelmed by events beyond his experience. "McKenna, I don't mind telling you that this whole business has me spooked. Sheriff McGrath never mentioned any federal investigation, and those agents showed up mighty convenient-like after all these murders." Thomas seized the opportunity to plant seeds of doubt. "Deputy, did you notice that Agent Morrison seemed to know an awful lot about the crime scenes before examining them? Almost like he'd been there before." Carmichael's eyes sharpened. "I was thinking the same thing. And that business about 3 federal officials being murdered, how did they know Judge Morse was dead? I haven't had time to identify the bodies yet. Maybe you should take a ride out to the eastern pasture and see what you find. I can show you where the tracks led from Willow Creek if that would help." The deputy nodded slowly. "I think that's exactly what I'll do. But McKenna, I'm going to need you to stay close until we get this sorted out. Too many people are dead, and I can't afford to lose the only witness." Thomas agreed readily. Staying close to Carmichael would provide some protection from Morrison's people while giving him access to official information about the investigation. More importantly, it would let him guide the deputy toward the truth without revealing his own dangerous knowledge. As they prepared to examine the murder scene in the eastern pasture, Maria approached with information that sent chills down Thomas's spine. "Senor McKenna, I thought you should know that the woman who shot Don William, she is asking for you. She says she has something important to tell you before it is too late." Thomas and Carmichael exchanged glances. Neither man was eager to interrogate a woman who'd suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown, but her testimony might be crucial to understanding the conspiracy. They found her in the root cellar, sitting quietly on a wooden crate, with her hands folded in her lap. The mad laughter had stopped, replaced by an eerie calm that was somehow more disturbing. When she looked up at Thomas, her eyes were clear but haunted. "You found them, didn't you? The judge and the sheriff and poor Mr. Hamilton from the Territorial Survey Office. We were supposed to meet them this morning to finalize the land transfer, but when we arrived at the meeting place, they were already dead." Her words confirmed Thomas's suspicions about the timeline while revealing new information. The eastern stranger had been Hamilton, a territorial surveyor, and the meeting at dawn had been planned in advance. The woman and her companion had discovered the bodies rather than committing the murders. "Ma'am," Deputy Carmichael said gently, "can you tell us your name and explain why you were meeting with these men?" "I'm Elizabeth Hartwell from the Consolidated Land Company in Chicago. We were purchasing the Rocking W Ranch through proper legal channels, with all the necessary federal approvals. Judge Morse was handling the court orders, Sheriff McGrath was ensuring legal compliance, and Mr. Hamilton was providing survey certification." The story made sense until Thomas considered the forged documents. If Consolidated Land Company was conducting legitimate business, why were their papers obviously fraudulent? Either Elizabeth Hartwell was lying, or she'd been deceived by her own associates. "Miss Hartwell," Thomas said carefully, "when you found the 3 men dead, what did you and your companion decide to do?" Her face crumpled with fresh grief. "Charles said we had to complete the transaction anyway, that too much money was involved to walk away. He had backup papers that would allow us to proceed without the official approval. But when Mr. Westbrook examined them, he said they were forgeries and ordered us off his property. The pieces were starting to fit together. Charles, presumably the man who'd fled in the buggy, had been prepared for the possibility that their official contacts might be eliminated. He'd brought forged documents as backup, planning to complete the land grab, regardless of the murders. When Westbrook recognized the forgeries, the situation had spiraled into more violence. "What happened to Charles?" Carmichael asked. "Where did he go when he left here?" Elizabeth shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. After I shot Mr. Westbrook, Charles said something about cutting losses and disappeared. He took the buggy and left me here with the body, and no way to explain what had happened." Thomas was beginning to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Consolidated Land Company had been working with corrupt territorial officials to steal the Rocking W Ranch through legal fraud. When someone, probably Morrison and his associates, had eliminated the officials to take control of the scheme themselves, Charles had attempted to complete the theft using forged papers. Now everyone involved was either dead or scattered to the winds, leaving behind a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. Deputy Carmichael looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. "Miss Hartwell, I'm going to have to place you under arrest for the murder of William Westbrook. But I want you to know that I'll make sure the territorial marshal understands the circumstances that led to this tragedy." As Carmichael prepared to transport his prisoner to town, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. He pulled the deputy aside and spoke in a low voice that Elizabeth couldn't overhear. "Deputy, there's something else you need to know. I've got documents hidden in my saddlebags that might explain this whole conspiracy. Papers I found scattered at the murder scene that show the real scope of what we're dealing with." Carmichael's eyes widened. "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" "Because I wasn't sure who could be trusted. Those federal agents were too eager to arrest me and too knowledgeable about things they shouldn't have known. I think they're part of the conspiracy, not investigators trying to solve it." The deputy considered this for a long moment before nodding. "Show me what you found." "But McKenna, if you're playing me false, I'll see you hang for these murders myself." Thomas retrieved the scattered documents from his saddlebags and spread them on the kitchen table. As Carmichael examined the papers, his face grew increasingly grim. The forged federal authorizations were obvious when compared to legitimate territorial documents, and the pattern of deception became clear. "This is bigger than just stealing one ranch," Carmichael said quietly. "These papers authorize the seizure of property throughout the territory. Someone's been planning a massive land grab using the federal government's authority." Thomas nodded. "And when their official partners got greedy or developed consciences, they eliminated them and tried to complete the scheme using forgeries. We're looking at a conspiracy that reaches from Chicago to the territorial capital." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their examination of the documents. Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see Morrison and Davis returning with several additional men, all armed and riding with military precision. The fake federal agents had apparently decided that leaving witnesses alive was too dangerous. "Deputy," Thomas said urgently, "we need to get out of here right now. Those men are coming back to tie up loose ends, and that includes both of us." Carmichael looked at the approaching riders and seemed to reach the same conclusion. "The back door leads to the creek bed. We can reach town through the cottonwoods if we move fast." As they gathered the documents and prepared to flee, Elizabeth Hartwell looked up with desperate eyes. "What about me? You can't leave me here for those men to find." Thomas hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. Whatever crimes Elizabeth had committed, she'd been used as a pawn in a larger game. Leaving her for Morrison's people would be condemning her to death. "She comes with us," he told Carmichael. "We'll sort out the legal issues later." The three of them slipped out the back door, just as the sound of the approaching horses reached the front yard. As they made their way toward the creek bed, Thomas caught a glimpse of Morrison directing his men to surround the house. The fake agent's face bore the cold expression of a man prepared to commit whatever murders were necessary to protect his conspiracy. The race for town had begun, and Thomas knew that their survival depended on reaching legitimate law enforcement before Morrison's people could silence them permanently. But as they hurried through the cottonwoods along Willow Creek, he couldn't shake the feeling that the conspiracy reached deeper into territorial government than any of them suspected. Even if they reached town alive, finding officials who could be trusted with the truth might prove impossible. Behind them, the sound of gunfire erupted from the ranch house as Morrison's men discovered their empty quarry. The hunters had become the hunted. And the next few hours would determine whether the truth about the Rocking W conspiracy would ever see the light of day. The cottonwoods along Willow Creek provided cover for the first mile, but Thomas knew that Morrison's men would track them easily once they discovered the fugitives had escaped the ranch house. Deputy Carmichael was breathing hard from the unaccustomed exertion, and Elizabeth Hartwell's traveling dress was already torn from pushing through the brush. "How far to town?" Thomas asked, helping Elizabeth over a fallen log. 5 miles if we stay in the creek bed, but that'll take us past the territorial road where they might have men waiting," Carmichael replied, checking his revolver's cylinder. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles north that might give us shelter while we figure out our next move." Thomas considered their options while scanning the hills for signs of pursuit. Morrison had brought at least 6 men, enough to split into search parties and cover multiple routes to town. The fake federal agents had shown themselves willing to commit murder to protect their conspiracy, and they'd have no qualms about killing a deputy sheriff if necessary. "Deputy, is there anyone in town we can trust completely? Someone who'd stand up to federal authorities if they came asking questions?" Carmichael thought for a moment while helping Elizabeth navigate the rocky creek bank. "Judge Patterson has been in Laredo County for 20 years, and he's not easily intimidated. If we can get these documents to him, he'd know how to contact real federal authorities." The sound of barking dogs behind them ended their planning session. Morrison had brought tracking hounds, which meant the creek bed would provide no concealment once the animals picked up their scent. Thomas made a quick decision that might save their lives or get them all killed. "We're going to have to split up. Deputy, you take Miss Hartwell and the documents straight to Judge Patterson. I'll lead the dogs away and try to reach town by another route. McKenna, that's suicide. They'll run you down within an hour." Thomas was already pulling off his boots and rolling up his pants legs. "Maybe, but it's our only chance. Those dogs are following my scent because I've been at both murder scenes. If I lead them east toward the territorial road, you might have enough time to reach safety." Elizabeth grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Mr. McKenna, you don't understand what you're up against. Charles showed me correspondence from people in the territorial capital, important people who were backing this land acquisition. If they're willing to murder federal officials, they won't hesitate to kill you. Miss, I've been killing and being killed at since I was 16 years old. This isn't my first time facing bad odds." Thomas handed Carmichael the expensive whiskey bottle that had started unraveling the conspiracy. "Give this to Judge Patterson, along with the documents. Tell him the bottle came from the murder scene, and if he can trace where it was purchased, he might find out who's really behind this scheme." The barking was getting closer, accompanied by the sound of horses moving through the brush. Thomas waded into the deeper part of the creek and began making his way downstream, leaving a clear trail for the dogs to follow. Behind him, he could hear Carmichael and Elizabeth heading north toward the line shack and eventual safety. The plan worked exactly as Thomas hoped it would. Within minutes, the pursuit shifted to follow his trail along the creek. He could hear Morrison's voice shouting orders, directing his men to spread out and prevent any escape toward town. The fake federal agent was taking no chances on losing his quarry this time. Thomas stayed in the water for another half-mile before climbing out on the east bank and deliberately leaving clear boot prints in the mud. The dogs would follow his scent regardless. But the visible trail would convince Morrison that his quarry was heading for the territorial road as planned. As he moved through the sagebrush toward higher ground, Thomas began to implement the second part of his desperate plan. He'd noticed something during his earlier ride that might provide the edge he needed to survive the next few hours. The hills east of the ranch contained several old mine shafts from prospectors who'd tried to find silver in the area during the 1,860 seconds. Most of the tunnels were shallow and abandoned, but they might provide defensive positions if he could reach them before the pursuit closed in. The first mine shaft was exactly where Thomas remembered it, hidden among a cluster of pine trees on the north slope of Cemetery Hill. The entrance was partially concealed by deadfall, and the tunnel extended maybe 30 feet into the hillside before ending at a collapse. More importantly, it provided a single entrance that could be defended by one man with adequate ammunition. Thomas checked his weapons while listening for sounds of pursuit. His Colt revolver held 6 rounds, and he had 12 additional cartridges in his gun belt. Not much for a sustained fight, but enough to make Morrison's people pay dearly for their victory if it came to that. The dogs arrived first, baying excitedly as they picked up Thomas's scent at the mine entrance. Morrison and 3 of his men appeared moments later, approaching cautiously with weapons drawn. The fake federal agent looked confident but wary, like a man who'd cornered dangerous prey before. "McKenna," Morrison called out. "You're trapped in there with nowhere to go. Come out with your hands up, and maybe we can work out an arrangement." Thomas positioned himself just inside the tunnel entrance, where he could see the approaching men without exposing himself to return fire. "What kind of arrangement, Morrison? The same kind you worked out with Judge Morse and Sheriff McGrath?" Morrison's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Those fools got greedy. Morse wanted to renegotiate his percentage, and McGrath was developing a conscience about stealing land from honest ranchers. They forgot that dead men can't spend money or testify in court." The casual admission confirmed what Thomas had suspected about the murders. Morrison and his associates had eliminated their official partners when the conspiracy became too risky or expensive to maintain. Now they were trying to complete the land grab using forged documents and intimidation. "What about Elizabeth Hartwell and Consolidated Land Company? Were they part of your scheme from the beginning?" The Chicago people provided capital and political connections, but they never understood the realities of territorial business. Sometimes you have to eliminate obstacles that legal paperwork can't remove. Davis appeared at the tree line with 2 more men, completing the encirclement of the mine shaft. Thomas was now trapped with 6 armed men surrounding his position, and no chance of escape. But the delay had given Carmichael and Elizabeth more time to reach safety, which might be enough to expose the conspiracy, even if Thomas didn't survive the day. "McKenna," Morrison continued, "you've got information that could cause problems for important people. But you're just a ranch hand caught up in something bigger than yourself. Help us clean up this mess, and there might be a place for you in our organization." Thomas considered the offer while evaluating his tactical situation. Morrison was offering corruption as an alternative to death, probably planning to eliminate him anyway once he'd served his purpose. The fake agent's tone suggested confidence that his quarry had no choice but surrender. "What kind of help are you looking for, Morrison? We need to know what documents you found at the murder scene, and whether you told anyone else about what you discovered. Cooperate with us, and you'll be well compensated for your discretion." "Olg. Commended, another Wyos." The negotiation was buying time, but Thomas wasn't sure what he was buying time for. Even if Carmichael and Elizabeth reached Judge Patterson safely, it would take hours to organize legitimate law enforcement response to the situation. Meanwhile, Morrison's men were probably moving into position for an assault on the mine shaft. The answer to Thomas's predicament came from an unexpected source. A rifle shot echoed across the hills, followed immediately by shouting from the men surrounding the mine. Someone was shooting at Morrison's people from long range, using what sounded like a buffalo rifle capable of hitting targets at considerable distance. "Down! Everyone take cover!" Morrison shouted. "Davis, find that shooter and eliminate him." More rifle shots crashed through the afternoon air, each one precisely aimed at Morrison's men. Thomas heard cursing and scrambling as the hunters suddenly found themselves hunted by an unknown marksman with superior position and firepower. Thomas used the confusion to improve his own position. He moved deeper into the mine shaft, where he could defend the entrance more effectively, while staying protected from the mysterious sniper. Through the tunnel mouth, he could see Morrison's men taking cover behind rocks and trees, trying to locate their new enemy. A voice called out from the hillside above, carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Morrison! You and your men have 30 seconds to throw down your weapons and surrender to territorial authority." Thomas recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to Marshal Frank Donovan, the territorial lawman responsible for federal crimes in this region. Somehow, legitimate law enforcement had arrived at exactly the right moment to prevent Morrison's conspiracy from claiming more victims. "Marshal Donovan," Morrison called back. "I'm Special Agent Morrison investigating federal crimes in this area. These men are assisting with the apprehension of suspects connected to multiple murders." Donovan's laugh was harsh as desert wind. "Morrison, I've been tracking your operation for 3 months. Judge Morse contacted my office 6 weeks ago when he realized he was being used as a front for land theft. Sheriff McGrath was working undercover to gather evidence when you killed him. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. McGrath hadn't been corrupt. He'd been working with territorial authorities to expose the conspiracy. His presence at the morning meeting had been part of an investigation, not participation in the land grab scheme. "Marshal," Thomas called out from the mine shaft, "I've got documents that prove the federal authorizations were forged. Deputy Carmichael is taking them to Judge Patterson for safekeeping. Stay where you are, McKenna. We'll have this cleaned up shortly." What followed was less a gunfight than an execution. Morrison's men were caught in the open against an opponent with superior position, better weapons, and legal authority. The fake federal agents had built their success on intimidation and corruption, but they were no match for professional lawmen in honest combat. Morrison himself made a desperate attempt to escape, breaking cover and running toward the horses they'd left at the base of the hill. Marshal Donovan's buffalo rifle spoke once with authority, and Morrison pitched forward into the sagebrush, his conspiracy ending with a single well-placed shot. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas emerged cautiously from the mine shaft to find Marshal Donovan approaching with 3 other territorial officers. The marshal was an older man with gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that had seen too much violence but never grown comfortable with it. "McKenna, Judge Patterson sent word that you'd helped expose this conspiracy. I want to thank you for your courage in bringing the truth to light." Thomas looked around at the bodies of Morrison's men scattered among the pine trees. "Marshal, I'm not sure I understand how you knew to be here. This all happened pretty fast." Donovan smiled grimly. "We've been watching the Rocking W Ranch for weeks, waiting for Morrison to make his move. When our observer reported gunfire at the ranch house this morning, we knew the conspiracy was finally coming to a head. The mysterious watcher Thomas had spotted earlier had been a territorial officer keeping the ranch under surveillance. The investigation had been more advanced than anyone realized, with law enforcement agencies working together to build a case against the land theft ring. What about Elizabeth Hartwell? Is she going to face charges for killing William Westbrook? That'll be up to Judge Patterson and the territorial prosecutor, but I expect they'll consider the circumstances. Miss Hartwell was as much a victim of this conspiracy as anyone else. As the territorial officers began collecting evidence and preparing to transport the bodies, Thomas found himself thinking about the morning's events. The conspiracy had reached from Chicago to the territorial capital, involving corrupt officials, forged documents, and multiple murders. But it had been brought down by honest lawmen working together and a ranch hand who'd stumbled onto the truth at exactly the right moment. Marshal Donovan approached as Thomas prepared to retrieve his horse and return to town. The marshal carried something in his hand that made Thomas's blood run cold. A single rifle cartridge, bright brass gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "McKenna, I want you to have this. It's from the cartridge that ended Morrison's conspiracy." Sometimes in law enforcement, justice comes down to just a single shot, carefully placed and properly timed. Thomas accepted the cartridge with hands that trembled slightly. The brass case was still warm from the rifle chamber, and it represented the end of a conspiracy that had claimed 6 lives and threatened to destroy everything William Westbrook had built. "Marshal, what happens to the Rocking W Ranch now?" "Westbrook didn't have any family that I know of. His will left the ranch to his employees, to be divided among the hands who'd worked for him more than 2 years. Congratulations. McKenna, you're now part owner of one of the finest spreads in the territory." The news was overwhelming. Thomas had come to the Dakota Territory as a drifter with nothing to his name, and now he owned part of the ranch where he'd found purpose and dignity. More importantly, William Westbrook's legacy would continue, tended by the people who'd respected and served him. As they rode back toward town, Thomas reflected on the events that had begun with 3 bodies in a pasture and ended with justice served on a pine-covered hillside. The conspiracy had been complex and far-reaching, but it had ultimately failed because good people had been willing to risk everything to expose the truth. Deputy Carmichael met them at the edge of town with news that Judge Patterson had already telegraphed federal authorities about the forged documents. A real investigation would begin immediately, with territorial marshals working to ensure that anyone connected to the land theft conspiracy faced justice. Elizabeth Hartwell was waiting at the courthouse, her fate to be decided by people who understood that she'd been used rather than corrupted by the conspirators. Her testimony would be crucial in exposing the full scope of the Chicago connection and ensuring that Consolidated Land Company faced consequences for their role in the murders. That evening, as Thomas sat in the ranch house kitchen sharing coffee with Maria Santos, he pulled out the rifle cartridge that Marshal Donovan had given him. The brass case gleamed in the lamplight, a simple object that represented the difference between justice and chaos on the frontier. Maria, Marshal Donovan told me that sometimes justice comes down to just a single shot. I think he was talking about more than marksmanship. The wise old woman nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. See, Thomas, in this life, we sometimes get only one chance to do the right thing. The important thing is recognizing that moment when it comes. Thomas set the cartridge on the kitchen table where it could catch the light. It would stay there as a reminder that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over safety, truth over convenience. The Rocking W Ranch would continue operating under new ownership, tended by people who understood that some things were worth defending regardless of the cost. The conspiracy that had threatened to steal their future was ended, brought down by honest law enforcement and a ranch hand who'd refused to let murderers profit from their crimes. Outside, the Dakota wind whispered through the cottonwoods along Willow Creek, carrying the promise of another day in a land where justice was sometimes hard-won but never impossible to achieve. The frontier demanded courage from its people, and when that courage was found, it could change everything with just a single shot, carefully aimed and righteously fired. As Thomas prepared for sleep in his own room in a house he now partly owned, he thought about the morning's discovery of 3 dead men in a pasture. That moment had started a chain of events that revealed corruption, exposed conspiracy, and ultimately restored justice to Laredo County. Sometimes the most important moments in a man's life began with the simple decision to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The brass cartridge gleamed on the kitchen table, catching the last light of day and reflecting the promise of tomorrow in a land where honest men could still make honest livings, and where justice, though sometimes delayed, was never permanently denied.